Welcome back to Liberty Hour. I'm your host, Alex Newman. Thank you for joining us on the American Media Periscope Network. Again, do sign up for AMP Insider. Check out our advertisers. Our next guest is Dr. Brian Ray. He's the president of National Home Education Research Institute. You can find him online at NHERI.org. He is internationally known for his research on home education. He's published numerous peer-reviewed articles. He's done books. He's done chapters in books for almost 4 decades. He often serves as an expert witness in courts and legislatures. He has served as a professor of science, professor of education at the undergraduate and the graduate levels. He's got a degree in biology. He's got a master's in zoology from Ohio State University. He's got a PhD in science education from Oregon State University. Dr. Ray, welcome to the program. Thank you so much for joining us. Obviously, there's been an increasing attack on homeschooling. We've seen Sweden ban homeschooling. Obviously, we saw Adolf Hitler ban homeschooling. Now we've seen the French and the Portuguese. More and more governments are coming down. And now we have a movement afoot in the United States with very powerful individuals in the legal profession saying we need to just ban homeschooling. The lady from Harvard says we need a presumptive ban on home education because parents might teach their kids bad stuff. They might not get a good education. They might even abuse their kids. What do you make of this, Dr. Ray? Should we be concerned about the well-being, the education of children who are being educated at home by their parents?
We should not be concerned in a bad way. I mean, we've had thousands of years of people wanting to control the education of children. I mean, that's what government-run education is all about. It's about teaching, training, and indoctrinating children. People in the early years of America knew that it was a battle over what children think. I mean, there were many people who were opposed to government-run schooling and the forced redistribution of wealth to teach children. The ones who wanted it, they basically won. So that's where we are, Alex. But anyway, so when you have people like Dr. Bartolet and others making claims, you'll notice that it's almost always without empirical basis. So there should not be a negative concern. In fact, if we talk about it and I lay out for you the research on homeschooling over the last 35 years, maybe people should be promoting homeschooling more. As you can see here, that ever since the start of the rebirth of homeschooling in America, after home education had become extinct by the 1970s, there's been steady growth year after year after year. And I want people to keep in mind that before 1900, parent-directed home-based education was the norm in America, and it was the norm all over the world. So, from home education, we got inventors, artists, authors, candlestick makers, butchers, legislators, lawmakers, mathematicians, the pyramids, all these kinds of things. So people have to remember that institutionalized schooling is not what made necessarily any nation great. So, that's what we know so far. And if people look at the academic achievement of homeschool, that was one of the first things that researchers wanted to know was, but how in the world can parents who are not government approved teachers possibly teach their children how to read, write, do arithmetic? I mean, after all, doesn't it take 4 years of a college education to teach a child that the letter A has 3 sounds, a, ah? Well, the answer is no. I did a review of research, peer-reviewed research, only peer-reviewed research. I kind of narrowed it down that way. And 63% of the 19 peer-reviewed studies so far in academic achievement 63% show the home educated are doing statistically significantly better than those in institutional schools. So, that does not mean that all children who are home educated are above average. That's ridiculous. Not everybody's above average all the time, but it does tell us that typically and on average, if you home educate your child, he or she will do better in terms of academic achievement than if you had put them in an institutional school. So, that was one of the first big questions that researchers asked. And then, of course, homeschool families know, and they've all heard the question, they call it the S question. And researchers wanted to know too, what about socialization? Now, I'll give you the research and I'll make a few comments or we can talk about it if you want. It's going to sound like a broken record. 64% of all peer-reviewed studies on the social and emotional development of children show that those who are being home educated are doing better in terms of their social and emotional development than those in institutional schools, which, some people are surprised. I'm not surprised. Maybe we'll get into why or why not. Then the researchers want to, okay, well, maybe they're doing okay academically. Maybe they're doing okay in terms of social and emotional development. But what about how are they going to do in adulthood? And researchers have used all kinds of measures to look at success or how people are doing in adulthood. And here's what we got so far: 50%, half the studies have shown that the home educated are doing statistically significantly better than those who went to conventional schools in adulthood, including college. So some people might ask, well, what about the other 50% of the studies? Most of those studies show no significant difference or a few mixed results. But overall, the weight of it is that the home educated are doing better. So, basically we have so far now, after about 35 years of research, that those children who are homeschooled, for those who are homeschooled, and even when some of the demographics are controlled statistically in the studies, they're doing at least as well and typically better than those who went to institutional schools. So really at this point, I suggest that professional educators and the general public should be saying, not are we concerned about home education, but if that's true, if those studies are true, why are we not actively and proactively promoting home education to all parents?
Yep, absolutely. And frankly, I'm terribly concerned about the children in government schools. The idea that government schools, where less than one third of the children, according to the federal government's own data, are proficient in anything, should be worried about homeschool. I mean, it's frankly flabbergasting to me.
Yeah, it
Dr.
is.
Ray,
Yeah, it is.
so we've seen this huge growth in homeschooling. We saw a big surge during COVID. It's eased back a little bit, but based on the trend, and we showed the graph earlier, but based on the trends that we're seeing, do you expect homeschooling to continue growing? And what is driving that growth? Yeah, there's better academics. Yeah, there's better socialization. They're doing better later in life. But what's causing so many more parents to pull their kids out of
Yeah.
traditional institutional schools and do it at home?
Well, let's touch one more thing I left out. There's not a lot of research on this, but it ties right into what your two previous guests were talking about: worldview. How do people think? Why do we think what we think? Why do we believe what we believe? Why do we vote like we vote? Why do we watch the movies we watch? Why do we spend the money the way we spend money? And I want to say this. I'm going to get to a little bit of research in a moment. If you have your children under the teaching, training, and indoctrination, and by the way, I use indoctrination whether it's public schooling, homeschooling, or private schooling. Education is always pouring values and beliefs into children. It's teaching them doctrine. So if your children are under the teaching, training, and indoctrination of statism, socialism, genderism, CRT, secular humanism, LGBTQIaism, and whatever, for 12 years, 6 hours per day, what would you expect them to be thinking like when they come out at 18 years of age? And I think that parents, whether they call themselves conservatives, whether they call themselves classical liberals, whether they call themselves Christians, they've got to think about this. And when they see legislators voting the wrong way, or they see culture going the wrong way, they have to look at themselves and say, what in the world am I letting my child be indoctrinated into for 12 years? It's really hard to undo that. So now we know from research, what we have so far, that when children are home educated, they end up more strongly believing and affirming the worldview of their parents than they would otherwise. And so that gets back to, why is homeschooling growing? Homeschooling is growing because the reasons for home educating are very fundamental, and they have been for the last 35 years. That is, parents want strong academics. And by the way, this is not in any particular order. Parents want strong academics. They want more family time. They want stronger family relationships. They want less distraction for the children. They want less bullying of the children. They want a more customized education for their children. They want the education to be individualized to the child's strengths, weaknesses, dreams, and desires. And they want their children to learn a worldview that they would not get in a place called government or public school. And I think during the last few years of the government lockdowns of schools, when children were at home, parents got a firsthand glimpse of reality into what's happening in the schools. And many parents know, it is the antithesis. It is totally opposite of what they want their children to be hearing during the day. So many people experienced homeschooling. By the way, government school at home was not homeschooling. But a lot of people could see through that and say, hey, this is not the greatest thing run by the government. But if we could do this as a family in a relaxed environment by choice, this is a lot better than institutional schooling, especially run by the government. So I think it's going to continue to grow, 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 Alex. There are a lot of growth factors. There are some limiting factors. But when more people homeschool, there's less adult peer pressure against it. And we also know from research that those who were home educated, when they're adults and have children, they will homeschool their children at a higher rate. So I think we're going to continue to see growth in the population of homeschooling.
Yeah, and just from my anecdotal experience, all the things that you're saying are just so obviously true. Homeschooled children are doing so much better in everything that you can kind of observe, than the kids coming out of the government schools, and also just more and more families. We had an open house the other day at one of our co-ops. Just amazing the number of families that are now considering this. Dr. Ray, what do you think about these efforts to ban and further regulate homeschooling? Do you think they're going to find, I know it's hard to predict the future, but do you think they're going to find success as they push on this?
It's happening in some other nations. In the United States, again, we've been talking about history and worldview here. We still have a pretty strong history and culture of independence. The second thing is, and I'm reflecting back at what I think his name was Pastor Paul Blair said, parents need to stay engaged. They need to stay involved in the culture when it comes to contacting legislators, making phone calls. And here's what we've seen in the homeschool world. The homeschool world is amazing. It is one of the only truly true freedom spaces. I call it the Homeschool Freedom Space. And when legislators start to talk about bills that would encroach on the freedoms of parents to do their duty to educate their children, homeschool parents come out in droves. They can shut down phone lines of legislators. They show up by the hundreds, and some states thousands, to testify against these bills. So right now, it's not scary for the freedom of parental rights in America, but constantly in every state, people have to stay alert. They got to stay in touch with their lobbyists who protect parental rights. They need to stay in touch and be members of groups like the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. So it's always the power mongers and the people who like to control children are always trying to do something to control children and take away home education rights. So we always have to be on the alert if we believe in that, Alex. Always, every day, every week, every legislative session. Never let up.
Yeah. And it's like that with all liberties. I mean, our founding fathers warned us that the price of liberty is going to be eternal vigilance. You have to beware because there are always totalitarians among us who want to take our freedoms. It's just, human nature. We live in a fallen world. Dr. Ray, um, there's big things going on right now in education world. As you know, my state here in Florida, we just signed this universal school voucher thing. Just this week, a similar measure up in Georgia failed. The Democrats and some Republicans teamed up to block it. But Utah has just adopted one. Last year, Arizona adopted one where basically the government wants to give taxpayer money, public money, to homeschoolers, Christian schools, private schools. And there's a lot of, I guess, division among conservatives and even among some Christians, even some of the homeschool community. The leadership's pretty united against it, but among the actual homeschool families, there are quite a few that want government money. What are your thoughts on this whole issue? Should the government be giving us money to homeschool or do Christian school?
I think this goes again right back to your previous guest, Alex. We need to think fundamentally. Either if you say that you're a Christian, you got to think fundamentally like the Bible talks about. If you say you're a classical libertarian liberal, you need to think about that and follow that. So from those two worldviews, the government from the get-go should have no authority, no involvement in the teaching, training, and indoctrination of children. So in reality, from those two worldviews, we should have never had government public schooling, and we should not have the government taking Alex's money, property by force, and giving it to Susie's or Sally's or Billy's family for the education of children. So that's the fundamental issue right here. And I would say that if a person says he's a conservative or a Christian or classical liberal, he should be fighting against the redistribution of wealth for education, not for more ways to do it. I mean, it's the duty of parents. It's their responsibility to raise and educate children, not the government. So that's the fundamental, basic thing. And we all need to live from those fundamental things and not pragmatics. But I will give a pragmatic. Whenever there is government money involved, that's called tax dollars, whether it's for public charter schools, public institutional brick and mortar schools, or these redistribution of wealth efforts to private schools and homeschoolers, There must be government control. We all believe in government control. If the Army can get a hammer for $22, but they got a contract and they're paying $99 per hammer, we should all be upset. We want the government to control what happens with our money. So every single one of these alleged conservative legislators or people who are promoting tax dollars to private schools and to homeschoolers should say, I believe as soon as the tax dollars are given to these private schools and homeschoolers, we should control them more and more and more. And every single parent should be thinking about this. If they have their children in private education or homeschool private education, they should say, if the government gives me a tax dollar, I want the government to control me a whole lot to make sure I'm spending the money the way the government wants me to spend it. That's the clearest way I can say it, Alex. Tax dollars will have controls. We know that from research, the history of government money all over the world. People can look at Dr. Charles Glenn's book, The Ambiguous Embrace. It's a scary title, The Ambiguous Embrace. When tax dollars flow to nonprofit private institutions and organizations, they lose their zeal, they lose their mission, there are more controls of them. That's what happens. And I don't know why people who call themselves conservatives and Christians are promoting the expansion of socialism and statism by what's called school choice with a capital SC. I really, really want to challenge people to stop promoting that.
Yeah. And this is a discussion that I think needs to be had because they've got a lot of momentum right now. The wind is in their sails. And you hear, typical arguments like, well, they're taking all my money to pay to brainwash other people's kids. I should get a little bit of it back, right? And I think there's better solutions than that.
Yeah. Alec, can I say something on that?
Please do.
Americans think there's all this money out there in a pool, somewhere in a puddle. Like, okay, I'm a taxpayer. I've got my children in Catholic schools or Lutheran schools, or I'm homeschooling them, and I'm paying my property taxes. So there must be a bucket of money out there already waiting for me to take that from my children. That's not how it works, Alex. The money that's being collected right now, that's being taken from you by force, taken from your neighbors by force for schooling, is paying for the public school students who are already in the government schools. If private educators, private schools, and private homeschoolers start saying, I want government money, the government has to raise more taxes and start taking more property and money by force. Now, I know there's some complicated formulas, and some people say, well, it's not quite that simple, Brian. The simple fact is, if you have more kids under government funding for education, you've got to raise taxes.
Yep, no question about it. And of course, the control will follow. It's what's happened everywhere. Dr. Brian Ray, I want to thank you so much for coming on the program. The website is NHERI.org. I rely on it a lot in my own journalism, my own reporting. Thank you for all that you do. Thank you for your research, and thank you for coming on the show.